I said I don't think there's much to say about myself except that I teach political science at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm in the Centre for Political Studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences there. And I'm not much of an activist to speak of, but I have a lively and healthy interest in all matters of politics, as indeed women's studies. And I'm currently, very briefly, which might explain why I'm partly here, I'm currently, and as I said rather briefly, looking after the Women's Studies program, which has just been established in JNU just last year, which means about August of 2000. Now, what I'm going to do today is just basically, the title of my paper, if I may just read, the title is Women's Reserve Seats and the Politics of Presence. The curious, and the subtitle, which most of you will not understand, but nonetheless the subtitle is The Curious Case of 500 versus 42. 500 versus 42 simply refers to the strength of the Lok Sabha, the House of People in India, which is 542. And there are 500 members who, within quotes, have always supported women's reservations, and there are supposedly only about 42 who are opposed to it, and yet the bill has been stalled. Now, so basically I'm going to speak on women's, this whole debate and controversy, a rather raging and heated controversy in India on the question of reservations for women in legislatures. Now, if I look at my own discipline, that is the discipline of political science in India, as indeed outside India, it's been characterized by a divide between the many who study the state and the few who study social movements. By contrast, the field of women's studies has been divided between the many who study popular culture, civil society, and cultural politics, and the few who study the state. However, with the growth of postmodernism, feminist critiques of the state, and studies of women's resistance, many scholars have rejected monolithic conceptions of the state and have begun to explore women's agency and their dealings within by actively working within dominant institutions through their own creativity and resourcefulness. Women are most likely to use their power in transformative ways when they bring to the state a commitment and ongoing connection to social movements. A lack of connection to social movements greatly attenuates the power women can wield through institutions. Women's connection to movements provides a vital counterweight to the pull of institutions towards moderation and centrism. There are innumerable examples of state co-opting movements, but countless examples as well of movements surviving and even thriving as a result of their dealings with the state. In India, for example, the Dalit movement is a very good example of a movement which in some senses is so closely, Dalit movement, that is the lower caste movement, is so closely connected to the state, and yet one would not say, and one of their major concerns is to get into the state and to be able to use the state for their own good, so to speak. And there's no indication that, well, in one way they have been co-opted, but in another way that hasn't really sort of ended, if you like, the Dalit movement. So I suggest that there are three factors that are especially important in determining what outcome is more likely. That is, whether co-optation is more likely or possibly women might make use of political institutions. One, of course, is the location of institutions, whether we are talking of local institutions or we are talking of national level political institutions. Clearly, local level institutions offer greater opportunities for women, and it seems, as I shall just come to it, that women themselves, in India at least, are much more interested in getting into local institutions, that is the panchayats, as against national level institutions such as, let us say, the central government, the state government, or parliament, and so on, where it is, of course, more likely that more elite-oriented women would get into it, and also the chances of co-optation are that much greater. The second is the ways in which institutions, the second is, of course, that most institutions are gendered, and the concept of gendered institutions calls attention to a constellation of institutional traits rather than simply the people who occupy them. In general, the more powerful an institution, the less likely that women and women's interests will be represented. Women have been disadvantaged in state institutions which have been associated with men and masculinity. It follows that fewer women in dominant institutions, the more apt they are to behave like men when they are there. Now, of course, as has been discussed over the last couple of days, and I won't go into that, social movements are clearly more hospitable to women. Now, my point really, and that is my point of entry into what I have to say, is that no doubt co-optation is a serious challenge. However, the risks of co-optation must be set against the risks of marginality. As I said yesterday, women cannot easily give up on the state because it will not give up on them. Now, this brings me to the substance of what I have to say today, which is the debate on women's reserve seats. Now, in India, I think, as is well known, there are a number of prominent women who have been in the forefront of politics. Currently, several political parties in India, most notably the leading opposition party, the Congress, is headed by a woman, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, not to speak of several other regional parties which are also headed by women. Now, so participation, yet the participation of women in governance, which is what I'm concerned with right now, their presence in the political system is insignificant. This is despite the fact that sex equality and political rights for women are enshrined in the Constitution. Until the reservation of 33% seats for women in local government bodies came into being in 1992, gender bias pervaded all levels of governance in India. It is against this background of the continued marginalization of women in the Indian polity that the demand to reserve 1/3 seats at various levels of governance, particularly in local governments, marks a turning point in the debate over the political rights of women. From being acclaimed as a revolution of millions of deprived women to being dubbed as the token Bibi Beti Brigade, women's bid to challenge political monopolies and enter formal political institutions has generated a lively discussion, interest, and opposition. Now, in this paper, I explore the controversy over reserved legislative seats for women, and I describe three key moments in the development of this controversy since the 1930s. The negotiations over constitutional reforms in the closing years of British colonial rule, the discussions around a major government report on the status of women in 1974, and the present dispute over the Women's Reservation Bill, which seeks to amend the Indian Constitution to guarantee 33% reservations for women in Parliament, that is Lok Sabha, and the Vidhan Sabhas, which is the state legislative bodies. To do this, I shall at one level engage with the substantive issues raised in the debate surrounding the demand for a caste quota, that is a sub-quota within the women's quota, and the arguments within the women's movement for a gender quota, irrespective of caste or community. At another level, I shall build a minimalist argument for a politics of presence, and I take this term from a book, let's see. Well, anyway, this is the title of a book, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, in the time that I have, I won't really be able to go into all the three phases that I talk about, but let me just say very, very quickly a little bit about the first phase, that is the phase before independence. Now, legislative reservations for women were first discussed in the context of constitutional reforms in the 1930s. Now, the Government of India Act of 1919 and 1935 granted Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians separate electorates. The depressed classes were also given a few nominated seats. The Indian National Congress, opposed to special electoral rights, argued that reserved seats would irreversibly link religious identity and political power. Following its lead, most of the women's organizations associated with the nationalist movement, that is the All India Women's Congress, the National Council for Women of India, and the Women's India Association, though in the forefront for female enfranchisement and civil rights for women, opposed legislative reservations on the ground that to seek any form of preferential treatment would be to violate the integrity of the universal demand of Indian women for absolute equality of political status. Nationalists all over India made statements to this effect. But as far as Muslim women then, that is the Muslim League, was concerned, and as is well known, and I won't go over it, they of course were in favor. They were against the outright rejection of quotas, and unlike Congress women, Muslim League women were eager to obtain reserved seats. Even as Muslim men were unhappy at their quotas being diluted by women, Begum Shahnawaz Khan, who represented India at the first roundtable conference in London in 1930, believed that women required special representation. Now, yet, as women protested at the communal award, which had divided their ranks, the government went ahead and, what is more, subdivided the legislative seats along religious lines. Now, it's interesting that the All India Women's Conference, which was in the vanguard of opposition to the constitutional provisions reserving seats for women, nevertheless took advantage of the provisions for reservations. And in the 1937 elections, 56 women became legislators, 41 in reserved seats and only 10 in unreserved seats, and 5 in nominated seats. Now, after independence, the Congress government made partial attempts to fulfill the promises of constitutional equality it had made to women. The Constitution guaranteed women equal protection under the law and equal opportunity in public employment and prohibited discrimination in public life. The new state designed several policies to meet the demands and requirements of women. Many women were satisfied with these measures because they shared the customary view of the time that women would gain from economic growth, the main concern of the nation. However, despite their initial promise, democracy, equality before law, and universal adult franchise failed to remove gender inequalities. The Government of India in 1971 appointed the committee, the famous Committee on the Status of Women in India, to examine the constitutional, legal, and administrative provisions that have a bearing on the social status of women. The CSWI, in its famous report towards equality in 1974, presented a scathing critique of the political process, the worsening political position of women, and the inadequate positive impact of government-sponsored programs and policies on the status of women. This was the first unequivocal indictment of the government's promise of gender equality. It is noteworthy that the bleak picture of women's status shocked even the members of the committee. Despite indications of increased women's participation, their influence on the political process was negligible. In the course of the interviews and interactions with women, the committee found that women's lack of political equality was a matter of foremost concern to the women that they talked to. Consequently, women's groups pressed the committee to recommend reservations for women in legislatures. The committee, however, was divided, as a result of which this recommendation was never made. In fact, a majority of members felt that reservations for women, would be a retrograde step from the equality conferred by the Constitution. They argued that women, and I quote, "women do not constitute a community. They are not a category, and that women's interests should not be separated from the economic, social, and political interests of other groups, strata, and classes in society." The chairperson of this committee, Phul Renu Guha, Union Minister for Social Welfare and the only member to have participated in the national movement, epitomized the nationalist position. Disagreeing with the proposal to reserve seats in panchayats and municipalities, she argued in her note of dissent that such a step would help elite women and it would encourage separatist tendencies. These arguments were reminiscent of the nationalist argument personified by Sarojini Naidu's declaration in the 1930s, "I'm not a feminist." Much later, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi said much the same thing when she stated, and I quote, "I'm not a feminist, and I do not believe that anybody should get preferential treatment merely because she happens to be a woman," quote closed. Yet she referred to women as the biggest oppressed minority in the world. On the whole, this report argued persuasively that greater opportunities needed to be given to women to actively promote their participation in the decision-making process and to recognize the social inequalities and disabilities that hamper women. 25 years later, that is, let us say at the turn of the 21st century, the representation of women in India's central and state legislatures continues to be low. The average representation has been 6 to 7%. The percentage of women in the Lok Sabha, which was 4.4% in the first Lok Sabha elected in 1992, is now about a little over 8% in the 13th Lok Sabha elected in 1999. Within this, the number of Muslim women representatives is extremely small. Only 7 Muslim women have ever been elected to the Lok Sabha in the last 50 years. The situation, that is not of Muslim women, but of women in general, is much worse in state assemblies. The average percentage of women in state assemblies over the last 50 years was just 4%. The pattern is similar in cabinets and so on. Now, political parties have taken no initiative to reduce gender disparity in elected bodies. 2 years ago, the opposition Congress Party adopted a 33% target for women in the selection of candidates and positions in the party organizations. But in the 1999 elections, less than 12% tickets were actually given to women. Sonia Gandhi attributed the deficit to internal party pressures. Most political parties, in fact, pass on the blame to women themselves, i.e. their low winnability, even though it has been well established by now that compared to men, the performance of women in India's elections has been better. This underrepresentation exists despite the rising women's voter turnout, which is about 56% now, only 3% less than the average voter turnout, or if you might say about 3 or 4% less than that of women. And in fact, interestingly enough, in the last few elections, women's voter turnout has been increasing very significantly. And not only that, women's active participation in election campaigns and in the whole electoral process is quite remarkable. It's one of the remarkable features of Indian democracy. Political parties recognize the importance of increased female voter turnout. Yet representative institutions work in ways that does not always ensure sufficient policy concern for women. Eventually, it is this policy neglect and political institution that provides a justification for reserve quotas and a good reason for what Anne Phillips has described as a politics of presence, in which, and that's the title of her book, Politics of Presence, in which excluded groups are guaranteed fair representation as opposed to a politics of class, a politics of ideas, sorry. I'm certainly not opposed to a politics of class, I'm very much for it, as opposed to a politics of ideas in which choices between policies are made on the basis of ideologies and programs of political parties. Now to the controversy, which is the third phase, that is quotas in the 1990s. A gender quota in legislatures is a contentious issue. It excites and annoys the partisan and the non-partisan alike. While there are major differences among women's groups on the issue of reservations and more on the question of working closely with the state, an issue that we have been grappling with over the last 2 days, but a broad cross-section, in India at least, have moved in that direction. That is, in the direction of greater participation in political institutions and in the state. As a result, there's a growing consensus that representation in decision-making is vital for women's development. It's been pointed out that quotas are needed to break the social barriers that prevent women from effective participation. Several surveys, and I won't go into it, one conducted by the Centre for Study of Developing Societies in 1996, and another survey in which I'm associated with, which is a survey on the status of Muslim women in India. Both of them significantly reveal that 78%, that is both these surveys, the CSDS survey and the survey that we are doing, both reveals that 78% women endorse reservations. And what is interesting is that the survey that we have done is only is largely 80% of Muslim women, and almost 78% of them support reservations. And it is significant that a high proportion of women say that they would like to contest local elections and they would like to hold positions in local and state governments. This is particularly true of women from economically deprived backgrounds, that is in our survey, as indeed in the CSDS survey. That this is particularly true of women from economically deprived backgrounds, which is undoubtedly an indication of the importance of reservations as a means of political empowerment. This indicates an unmistakable shift from the nationalist position and also from the early days of the contemporary women's movement, which scoffed at the idea of reservation and representation on the claim, and I quote Radha Kumar, that such representation would lead to de-radicalization and that women engaging in it would put their own political interests before the feminist cause. There are two important reasons, I argue, for this shift. The last 2 decades have seen the growth of the women's movement with an expanding base in urban India. Questions of gender inequality were at the forefront of these movements. Spurred by the proliferation of women's groups and the socio-economic ferment in Indian society and the wider developments in politics, i.e. the rise of communalism and religious revivalism on the one hand, and developments in society, that is, lower caste assertions and caste conflicts, on the other, the gender question has been raised at different levels, especially the caste and class basis of gender inequalities. Although they addressed, that is, these movements, or the women's movement as a whole, addressed a range of issues, they have put less effort into electoral politics and have therefore had less impact on it. Women's reservation in parliament actually declined to 3% in 1977, the lowest ever. Though, as all of us know, the 1977 elections was one of the turning points in the consolidation of Indian democracy, because this was the election held immediately after the infamous emergency. And it was very much a vote for democracy and a vote against authoritarianism. And yet, as I said, women's participation was at its lowest, which it was, to be precise, 3.7%. Now, during this period, that is the period that I'm now talking about, the 70s and 80s and on to the early 90s, the women's movement began to search for new ways of wielding its influence over the state. This period then witnessed a confluence of two trends. On the one hand, the state's attempts to foster closer links with social movements and non-governmental organizations, and on the other hand, the attempt by some women's movement activists to exercise power within the state. The most important effort, and I think in my view, a really turning point in if you like, women's activism, women's involvement in politics, the most important, and in a certain sense, a turning point in Indian democracy, I would say, the most important effort to involve women in governance is by participating in elections to panchayats, which turned out to be significant against this background of increased women's activism and the state's effort to provide greater opportunities to women in governance. Part of the wider move towards political decentralization, the promotion of Panchayati Raj institutions over the last few years has sought to ensure adequate and active participation of women by providing quotas for various deprived groups. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment of 1992 introduced reserve quotas for women in local institutions. As a result, the number of women elected to panchayats increased to 1 million, and there are 1 million elected women members of panchayats. And I will not go into further details because there is also a reservation of women as far as heads of panchayats. So there's a reservation there as well, not just as members of the panchayats. Now, despite social and institutional constraints, women's participation has had a significant impact, that is, in panchayats. And I know I'm sort of treading into controversial territory because there's a big debate in India on the whole question of women's participation in panchayats, and there are two very strong views on it. But I take, as in most things, a sort of a middle ground on this. And I argue that despite social and institutional constraints, women's participation has had a significant impact in terms of both the subjective dimension, that is the ways in which women see themselves in their new roles, as well as the objective dimension, that is the actual development impact. Several studies have documented, and I won't go into the details, that women representatives give greater priority to issues such as drinking water supply, installation of pumps, playgrounds, roads, community infrastructure, schooling, etc. The impressive efforts of women demonstrate that panchayats are beginning to play an important role in the empowerment of women. In the light of this experience, and the point I'm trying to make is that I think the interesting thing about the Indian panchayat experience is that women are not just taking up women's issues, which is what one would expect women to do, but they are really taking up larger issues which are of interest to the public community, or if you like, to the larger community. And of course, it benefits women also. Now, in the light of this experience, the basic argument for reserved seats in legislatures then is the same. That is, these measures are historical correctives to discriminatory structures, ensuring that resources and benefits are distributed equally. In a representation submitted to the chairperson and members of the Parliamentary Select Committee, 7 women's organizations then urged the committee to recommend the passage of the bill in the Lok Sabha to reserve 33% legislative seats for women. The pressure mounted both by women in panchayats and women within political parties, so the pressure really is coming from women themselves. The pressure mounted both by women in panchayats and women within political parties obliged the government to table the Constitution 81st Amendment Bill 1996 to provide not less than 1/3 of the total seats for women in Parliament and state assemblies. However, this bill, which is popularly called the Women's Reservation Bill, has been listed for debate since 1996 in every session of Parliament, but a handful of leaders have stalled it each time. A slightly modified version, the Constitution 85th Amendment Bill 1999, was introduced in December 1999. But no discussion was allowed, with members of Parliament tearing up the bill each time it was listed for discussion. With the result, neither of the two bills has ever been discussed or voted upon. Now, the interesting thing is that all major political parties to this day support women's quotas in their election manifestos, and they publicly support the WRB. And this is what the title of my paper, which I said in the beginning wouldn't make sense to you, but this was a very interesting heading in the Hindu newspaper when the bill was recently introduced, which said exactly this: 500 versus 42. And I quote this report from the Hindu that if 500 members of Parliament are supporting the Women's Reservation Bill, why is the will of 42 who are opposed to it prevailing? What's more, since the relevant party, the women, want it, it is difficult to understand the reason for it not being put to vote, asked the Women's Political Watch in a memorandum submitted to the Speaker of the Lok Sabha. As one newspaper headline put it, and I quote again from the Hindu, "It is indeed a curious case of a lot of will but no bill." The most vocal opponents are small but powerful parties like the Rashtriya Janata Dal, the Samta Party, and the Samajwadi Party, and the Bahujan Samaj Party. Most of you may not be familiar with these parties, but most of these parties are lower caste parties, or the bulk of their support is concentrated among not the Dalits necessarily, except for the Bahujan Samaj Party, which is very much a Dalit party. But the other 3 parties that I mentioned are lower caste parties, that is, they get support from what the constitutional term in India is other backward classes, or OBCs. So effectively, it is basically all of these 4 parties in varying degrees are lower caste parties. Now, their contention is that elite upper caste women will monopolize reserve seats because they're better educated. Poolan Devi, very famous, I'm sure most of you have heard of her name, formerly a dacoit and now a member of parliament, disparaged the women's reservation bill because she said, and I quote, women with short hair and lipstick would get into, so almost nobody in this, I suspect nobody in this room would get in, according to her, because women with short hair and lipstick would get into parliament while OBC women would not. And she said our women are uneducated and cannot understand anything. So unless there's reservations for them, they cannot come to parliament. Now, some low caste leaders, and I wish I had the time to talk about this, some low caste leaders, and this is very interesting and a very interesting move they made, some low caste leaders have pushed for a sub-quota for Muslim women at a time when the legislative representation of Muslims is at its lowest. The percentage of Muslims who make up nearly 12% of the Indian population is a mere 4%. Several key states have no Muslim representatives. Muslims, as we know, and I don't really want to go into it, but I simply want to make the point that Muslims in India have been a socio-economically disadvantaged group since partition. But there are no quotas for them in government jobs or education. The main privilege they have is immunity for their personal laws, which permits multiple marriages and easy divorce. Successive governments have refused to deal with the problem of Muslim underrepresentation. And I argue, and well, not that I'm going to talk about it now, but I've argued elsewhere, that one major reason why government has got away from this problem is by focusing on personal laws and the preservation of personal laws and so on and so forth in the name of identity. So successive governments have refused to deal with the problem of Muslim underrepresentation, even as the last 2 decades are replete with all kinds of group ordering and group recognition by government for the purpose of representation. However, the substantive opposition to the WRB focuses on the issue of separate quotas for OBCs and scheduled caste women within the women's quota. Now, in the forefront, as I said, are these leaders, and basically, I think a point that I won't read out, but I think it's well known that we've had in India for the last 50 years a very, in my view at least, a very successful affirmative action program for the scheduled caste, and now recent and since 1994, an affirmative action program which reserves seats in government and in universities in education, in school education and higher education. To start with, it was only for scheduled castes, but now it's been extended to the OBCs as well. So that today in India, virtually 49% of all government positions at all levels, 49% of all government positions, and as you know, the government of India is one of the biggest employers. It is the biggest public employer in India even today. So about 49% positions are reserved for scheduled castes, about 22% for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and another about 30%. About another 27%, yes, 27% for the OBCs. Now, as caste-based mobilization has always been a marked feature of Indian politics, but it is much stronger today than when India became independent. Adult franchise and democracy have produced radical changes. No longer will caste groups accept Brahminical ordering of caste hierarchy and status, which implies that there is an even greater emphasis on caste identity and strategies of mobilization based on them. Through this strategy, lower castes have indeed succeeded in breaking the upper caste political monopoly. Today, the scheduled caste and backward caste constitute more than 2/5 of the members of the Lok Sabha, in contrast to a very negligible presence in the 1950s and 60s. But this impressive change has not benefited lower caste women. Political elite, and particularly the lower caste leadership, remain stubbornly male. There are hardly any OBC female MPs, and even as OBC men have greatly increased their numbers in parliament. The most vociferous opposition to women's quotas then has come from lower caste legislators and politicians who fear a loss of opportunities and are apprehensive that women's reservations will undo the lower caste challenge to upper caste domination. According to lower caste critics, women's quotas are a means to re-establish the monopoly of upper castes because their women will corner the benefits of quotas. Therefore, they demand a sub-quota within the women's quota for lower caste women. But I argue that there's really no real conflict between gender and caste. In fact, quotas are likely to facilitate the entry of women from all communities and castes into public life. Furthermore, while caste prejudice still exists in varying forms, the supposition that OBC women, that is lower caste women, are at a particular disadvantage appears to be a trifle misplaced, not only because it treats them as a homogeneous community, but also because it places them outside the prevailing electoral calculus which favors the numerically large lower caste in constituencies dominated by them. It is the numerical weight of lower castes that allowed OBC men to dominate most state legislatures and parliament without legislative reservations. The same logic, I reckon, would operate with women. It is highly unlikely that upper caste women would win elections from OBC-dominated constituencies. Even without quotas, women from these communities have managed to win more legislative seats than women from other groups. Paradoxically, lower caste leaders who have so assiduously emphasized their commitment to the interests of backward caste women are prepared to break the stalemate if the 33% quota were reduced to 10%, 10 to 15%. In other words, the issue was not sub-quotas for OBC women, but a high women's quota. A number of women leaders have correctly pointed out that reducing the proportion reduces the very purpose of quotas, as it would mean that not more than 7-8% women candidates could emerge as winners, a proportion that they have already attained without reservations. OBC leaders, on the other hand, justify the women's underrepresentation on grounds that there is a scarcity of experienced women. But it is difficult to sustain this argument, as it presumes that parties choose existing elected representatives, candidates on the basis of merit. This implies that the problem is not a caste sub-quota, but the gender divide over women's quotas. The recurring drama over the bill, which has been going on for the last 4 years, shows that opposition is not restricted to caste politicians. Rather, their vociferous opposition has simply made it easier for a more diverse group of male politicians to scuttle women's quotas. Now, why is gender singled out as a problematic category in the context of reservations? Is there a basis for a distinction between women as a group and caste and communities as a group? Should the category of women have preference over other group identities? The debate on quotas echoes feminist debates elsewhere about the status of women as a group, given their multiple locations in the polity. In India, the picture is of course complicated by the heterogeneity of society and the existence of numerous social groups demanding preferential treatment. There are at least 2 pro-women arguments and 1 pro-woman and identity-based, implicitly quota within quota position within the Indian women's movement. Recognizing women as a disadvantaged group, a powerful feminist case for women's reservation has justified affirmative action to redress the historical and continued disadvantages suffered by women. This is the left position, and this is the position that I support, needless to say. In short, reservations are necessary to expand the equality of opportunity and to make real the formal equality given by the Constitution. The most vocal advocates of this position are left parties and left groups, but this position is widely shared by women's groups and women in general. The second position is pro-woman but against reservations. For example, the editor of Manushi, many of you are familiar with her, has suggested an alternative proposal. Opposed to reservations, which according to her are unnecessary because, and I quote, because our country has a well-entrenched tradition whereby any party, politician or public figure who tries to badmouth women in public or opposes women in favor of, moves in favor of women's equality is strongly disapproved of. I think she's quite off the mark, but nevertheless. However, she concedes that Indian democracy has failed to include women in its purview because of the Gandhian legacy that saw women's role in politics as one of self-sacrifice rather than as a bid for power, and more recently because of corruption and criminalization of politics. Concentrating on women's interests, she advocates an alternate scheme under which parties should field at least 30% women candidates. Now, recently, a compromise measure supported by the Home Minister L.K. Advani has extended support to the Chief Election Commissioner's proposal, which is similar to the proposal made by Madhu Kishwar, which I just mentioned, which is that 1/3 seats in each region of the state, defined as a group of 15 to 20 contiguous assembly constituencies. That is basically what they're saying is that that instead of an amendment to the Constitution, which would reserve 33% seats in Parliament, parties should be obliged. And what the Election Commission is recommending is that the People's Representation Act 1951 should be amended such that political parties, much like what is done, I think in the Scandinavian countries, although in the Scandinavian countries, I don't think it has been sort of done quite in this way. It is more voluntary there. But in most of the Scandinavian countries, political parties, I believe, give 30 to 40% seats to women, but they're not obliged to do so. Here, the suggestion is that the People's Representation Act should make an amendment to it, should make it mandatory for political parties to give 1/3 tickets to women. But given the gendered response to women's participation in politics and the weakness of women's voices within political parties and alliances between party women and women's movement, it is unlikely that parties will agree to an amendment that would oblige them to give 1/3 nominations to women. At most, and I understand this, at most they will concede 10 to 15% seats to women. And I'm given to understand by some people who support this particular proposal, the party-based proposal, rather than the parliamentary proposal. They have been in touch with the Election Commission and with various political parties that there's some kind of an understanding being worked out between the Prime Minister Vajpayee or between the BJP and parties which have been in the forefront of opposition that I mentioned earlier, that even this amended proposal, it doesn't have to be 33%, that parties should agree to giving about 10 to 15%. That's exactly what many women's organizations have been saying, that the whole thing would become farcical. Whether you do, the issue is never, the issue was not really that there are problems, and I'll come to that in a second, because a number of people have raised issues about the Women's Reservation Bill. They've argued that it is flawed because the Women's Reservation Bill, suggests that every third constituency of the 554 constituencies would be reserved. So let us say if there were elections in 2002, every third constituency would be reserved. Then if hopefully elections are held only 5 years later rather than again in 2003, as we have been doing, having elections every year. So let us say that for the next 3 elections then, every single constituency would be reserved. So that it isn't as though there would be a fixed, it's not that, let us say the Lucknow constituency and the Bangalore constituency and the Delhi constituency, which is reserved in the 2002 elections, will remain reserved for the next 3 elections. No. If Lucknow is reserved today, the Barabanki constituency or the Ayodhya constituency would be reserved the next time. So the point then is that for the next 3 elections, according to the Women's Reservation Bill, every constituency would be reserved. Now, the argument that has been made, therefore, by the critics of the bill and the lower caste parties have also seized on this argument is that this principle of rotation is a highly flawed and a highly problematic principle because let us say somebody gets elected in 2002, and if they know that their constituency is going to be a reserved constituency in the next election, then there will be no incentive for the Member of Parliament to nurse their constituency, to do what they're supposed to do for their constituency. So it will, number one, hurt and damage the political career of legislators, and 2, as it is, accountability is so limited, there'll be even less accountability. Now, there is something to be said for this argument, I have to grant, but I would hasten to add, however, that, for example, there are constituencies reserved for scheduled castes in India, and they've been reserved for the last since 1952. Now, the Constitution envisaged that in the case of the reserved constituencies for scheduled castes, there would be a similar rotation, as is envisaged for the women's reservation. And there was indeed such a rotation of scheduled caste constituencies in the first 7 or 8 Lok Sabha elections. But since the 1971 elections, and I think we've had almost 7 elections since 1971, there has been no rotation of the scheduled caste constituencies, so that there is virtually, it's fixed. And there is little reason to think that something similar, you can say that constituencies for women will be reserved, will be rotated, but you don't have to do it, just as scheduled caste MPs have got together and have actually stopped the Election Commission from rotating constituencies because they say, well, it goes against their interests and so on. But anyway, left parties and the Congress party, particularly the leader of the opposition, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, have opposed this latest proposal of the Election Commission, which is to which is to ask parties to give reserve seats for women. Left-wing women's organizations, especially the All India Democratic Women's Association, which is the largest women's organization in India, has criticized this proposal, that is the new proposal, as a compromise formula that will only ensure tickets but not seats for women. Critics fear that political parties would give unwinnable seats to women, and given the poor track record of parties in nominating women candidates, there is no guarantee that parties will give winning seats to women. Okay, so the third position, I'm so sorry to be running over time, the third position derives from a growing body of feminist politics, and I think maybe I should run over it because this would be of interest. The third position derives from a growing body of feminist politics that wants to pay greater attention to group identity and the politics of competing identities of caste, community, and women. There are two identifiable positions here. The first one argues that public policies must be judged in terms of their sensitivity to the identities of people for whom they are designed. Therefore, the justification of a women's quota must move beyond an evaluation of consequences, that is, it is against a consequentialist argument, the kind that I'm probably trying to make, and pay attention to the identity concerns, which is a more fruitful way of understanding and ensuring the representation of women. As against this, there are those who support women's quotas as well as a sub-quota and point out that the timing of the Women's Reservation Bill and the support for it cannot be explained solely in terms of women's rights. To a certain extent, feminist and upper caste concerns, the second position within this argues, that they have joined together at this conjuncture to create a general acceptability of women's reservation, which is capable of restoring upper caste and class control of politics. Therefore, the lower caste demand for sub-quotas is justified. Moreover, identity, it is argued, is not pre-political. It does not exist independently, and this position has been made by Nivedita Menon, a former student of mine, in an article in the Economic and Political Weekly, and she argues that that identity is not pre-political. It does not exist independently of ideology, and presence is constituted by a number of identifications, of which gender is only one. But as to this position, I would argue that there are critical questions here. In particular, arguments that relate to the wider issue of representation versus presence of women from lower castes and minorities. The answer to these questions must deal with the key issue of competing identities of caste, community, and gender. Women are seldom, if ever, defined as a cultural group, despite the fact that women do have a shared history and shared experience. Given the dispersal of identities across class, caste, religion, and other axes, gender cannot be the sole rallying point for women. However, despite their innumerable differences, women can be conceived of as a category on the basis of their oppression in a world defined by a sexual division of labor. And despite all the differences in feminist positions as to whether the concept of woman constitutes a universal category, the fact is that for some purposes and at some levels, they continue to act as such, and the world continues to treat them as though they represent a category. At a certain level, women from a particular group that has shared experiences of social discrimination and exclusion can also be seen as a group. At another level, these experiences cannot be taken to constitute these women as a permanent cultural group that requires quotas within quotas. The problem with the sub-quota argument is that it sees lower caste women as a separate category representing a particular constituency. As a number of critics, including myself, of sub-quotas have pointed out, it is difficult to see how any sub-quota is possible without a further sub-quota for those listed as most backward within the sub-quota of lower caste women. Though the claim for sub-quotas emanated from an apprehension that elite women should not corner all the benefits, it does not differentiate between the privileged and the less privileged women within the lower castes. It has raised never-ending disputes over which groups of women should be eligible for reservations. The quotas within quotas can distort the practice of representation because in the course of redressing political imbalance, it tends to valorize mirror representation, which means, for example, that only Muslim women can represent Muslim women, or that Tamil Hindus can only represent Tamil Hindus. Given India's stunning social diversity and the high level of polarization in the polity, the logic of such separation can go on ceaselessly. Besides, it is difficult to restrict it to excluded groups. In conclusion, then, there's clearly been far greater resistance to national and state-level reservations for women by political parties than by the public. As noted earlier, the public favors the active participation of women in politics, and an overwhelming majority favors reservations for women in legislative bodies. There's been a much greater gendered resistance to reservations in legislatures than in panchayats, and this itself is something quite interesting. A number of doubts have been raised about legislative reservations, ranging from the argument that such a provision would ghettoize women in politics to the fear that a quota system would only result in women fighting each other in women-only constituencies, which will not give them the confidence or experience to hold their own, no matter who their opponents. In effect, a measure seeking to obliterate gender divisions will end up creating new gender divisions. Then there's the widely shared apprehension that quotas encourage proxy politics and women representatives will become pawns manipulated by vested interests in family and society. But these problems are more likely these problems are there. But at the same time, I think I would say that though the power of women MPs is generally limited, and like most members of parliament, they're liable to support party agendas than women's agendas, yet many women MPs have been influential leaders in their own right. Many of them have risen to power through institutional channels than simply as appendages of men. Of course, the power of these women to influence policy agendas would be better if they were more closely linked with the women's movement. Another way is to strengthen the links between women's movement and institutions, particularly political parties. This requires women legislators to forge closer ties with women in office. Together, they can focus attention on such issues as poverty, housing, unemployment, and healthcare. Thank you.